In the spring of 629, a letter arrived at the palace of King Dagobert I in Paris. It came from the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, the most powerful Christian ruler on earth, fresh from recapturing Jerusalem and the true cross from the Persian Empire after one of the longest and most devastating wars in ancient history. The letter contained a warning. Heraclius's astrologers had made a terrifying prediction. They told the emperor that a circumcised people would destroy his empire. Heraclius was taking no chances. He had already ordered the forced baptism of every Jew in the Byzantine Empire. Now he was urging his ally Dagobert to do the same in Francia. Within months, Dagobert issued one of the most drastic edicts in early medieval history. Every Jew in the Frankish Kingdom faced a choice: convert to Christianity or leave. It was the first mass expulsion of Jews from a major Western European kingdom, and for the next century, there would be virtually no mention of Jews living in Francia. But here's what makes this story more complicated than it first appears. This wasn't simply a case of innocent people being persecuted for their faith. Just 15 years earlier, Jewish armies had helped the Persian Empire conquer Jerusalem, and Christian sources claimed that tens of thousands of Christians had died in the aftermath. Jewish soldiers, by their own records numbering between 20,000 and 26,000, had fought alongside the Persians. They had helped breach the city's walls, and according to Christian chronicles, some had participated in the violence that followed. The expulsion of 629 was, at least in part, a retaliation for a war that Jews had actively fought in and, according to many accounts, had won. The Jews who faced expulsion in Francia had nothing to do with those events, but in the medieval world, communal identity was everything. What one group of Jews did was blamed on all Jews everywhere. The prophecy, meanwhile, wasn't about Jews at all. The circumcised people who would devastate Heraclius's empire hadn't even appeared yet. They were the Arab Muslims, who would sweep out of the Arabian Peninsula just 3 years later and conquer half the known world. The true threat was gathering in the desert while everyone was focused on the wrong enemy. So how did a geopolitical miscalculation in Constantinople lead to the destruction of an entire community 1,000 miles away? Why did Jews in Palestine take up arms against Byzantium? And what role did their own choices play in the catastrophe that followed? To understand what happened in 629, we need to go back 2 decades to a war that nearly destroyed both the Roman and Persian empires, and to a city that 3 religions considered holy. Jews had lived in Gaul for a very long time. They had arrived with the Roman legions, settling in cities like Marseille, Arles, Narbonne, and Paris during the height of the Roman Empire. By the time Rome fell, Jewish communities had been part of Gallic society for over 4 centuries, and for most of that time the relationship between Jews and their neighbors had been remarkably peaceful. Jewish merchants traded goods across the Mediterranean, maintaining connections with other Jewish communities around the ancient world. These networks of trust and credit facilitated long-distance trade in ways that few other groups could match. A Jewish merchant in Marseille could do business with a Jewish merchant in Alexandria, connected by religious bonds that transcended political boundaries. Jewish craftsmen worked alongside Christians in the cities. Jewish physicians served at royal courts. Some Jews achieved considerable wealth and influence. They owned land, employed servants, and participated in the same elite social circles as Frankish nobles and Roman aristocrats. In the 6th century, we even have records of Christians attending Jewish feasts and adopting Jewish customs, much to the frustration of local bishops. The early church councils spent considerable energy trying to keep Christians and Jews apart, not because the communities were hostile to each other, but because they were getting along too well. The Council of Orleans in 533 felt compelled to forbid intermarriage between Jews and Christians. The Council of Macon in 581 tried to prevent Jews from holding positions as judges or tax collectors. The frequency of these prohibitions reveals something important about daily life in Merovingian Gaul. Christians and Jews were neighbors. They did business together. They ate together. Their children played together. The bonds of community often proved stronger than the directives of distant bishops. Some Christians even kept the Jewish Sabbath, resting on Saturday rather than Sunday. Others avoided pork, following Jewish dietary practices. A few seem to have attended synagogue services, curious about the older religion that Christianity had emerged from. These councils weren't responding to conflict. They were responding to integration. Jews weren't outsiders being pushed to the margins. They were insiders being pulled into the mainstream of Frankish society. But the Frankish Kingdom in the 6th and 7th centuries was not a stable place. It was a realm torn by almost constant civil war, ruled by kings who murdered their own relatives and burned entire cities over succession disputes. The Merovingian dynasty, which had united the Franks under King Clovis in the late 5th century, spent the next 100 years tearing itself apart. Clovis had converted to Christianity in 496, making the Franks one of the few Germanic peoples to embrace Catholic Christianity rather than the Arian heresy that dominated most of the barbarian kingdoms. This gave the Frankish kings a special relationship with the Catholic Church and eventually with the Pope himself. But that special relationship came with expectations. The Church expected Catholic kings to promote the faith, and by the early 7th century, promoting the faith increasingly meant distinguishing Christian society from everyone else. When Clothar II finally reunited the Frankish kingdom in 613, after decades of civil war, he inherited a realm that was exhausted, fragmented, and desperate for stability. The aristocracy had gained enormous power during the conflicts. The mayors of the palace, who had once been merely the managers of the royal household, now controlled much of the actual governance of the kingdom. To secure his position, Clothar had to make concessions. In October 614, he issued the Edict of Paris, what's sometimes called the Frankish Magna Carta. This document reserved many rights to the nobility and granted the Church significant authority over certain matters. But buried within that edict was something else, a clause that excluded Jews from all civil employment for the crown. Now, this wasn't an expulsion. Jews could still live in the kingdom, still practice their religion, still conduct their businesses. But they could no longer serve as judges, tax collectors, or any other officials of the royal government. The immediate effect was to transfer a great deal of administrative literacy from Jewish officials to the Church. The bishops, who came almost exclusively from the Frankish nobility, now had a near monopoly on the written word within the Merovingian state. Literacy was power, and the Church was consolidating it. Clothar probably saw this as a reasonable compromise. He was giving the Church something it wanted, strengthening his alliance with the bishops. And the nobles were pleased because bishops came from their own ranks. The Jews lost their government positions, but they weren't being persecuted. Not yet. Clothar ruled until 629, when he died at the age of 45. He was succeeded by his son Dagobert, who had already been ruling the eastern portion of the kingdom, Austrasia, since 623. Dagobert was young, ambitious, and deeply pious. Born around 603 or 605, he had been groomed for power from childhood, tutored by two of the most powerful figures in the Frankish Church, Arnulf of Metz, who would later be canonized as a saint, and Pepin of Landen, ancestor of the Carolingian dynasty that would eventually replace the Merovingians. He would become the last Merovingian king to exercise real political power, before the dynasty declined into a series of puppet rulers controlled by the mayors of the palace. He built the great basilica of St. Denis outside Paris, which would become the burial place of French kings for over 1,000 years. He patronized the church lavishly, and he maintained close diplomatic relations with the Byzantine Empire. But to understand why those diplomatic relations would lead to catastrophe for the Jews of Francia, we need to travel east. Far east, to a war that had been raging for over 2 decades and was finally reaching its climax. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of the old Roman Empire, had been locked in an apocalyptic struggle with the Sasanian Persian Empire since 602. This was not a normal war. This was a fight for survival. It began when the Byzantine Emperor Maurice was overthrown and murdered by a usurper named Phocas. Maurice had once helped the Persian king Khosrow II regain his throne, and Khosrow used Maurice's death as a pretext to launch an invasion that would nearly destroy the Byzantine Empire. For 20 years, the Persians advanced. They conquered Syria in 613. They took Damascus, Antioch, and Emesa. They swept through Palestine. And in 614, after a brutal 3-week siege, they captured Jerusalem itself. What happened in Jerusalem would haunt Christian memory for centuries. Persian forces, aided by local allies, stormed the city. According to Christian chronicles, somewhere between 17,000 and 66,000 people were killed. The patriarch Zacharias was taken prisoner. 35,000 Christians were deported to Mesopotamia. And most shocking of all, the Persians carried away Christianity's most sacred relic. The true cross, the very wood on which Christ had been crucified, was taken as war booty to the Persian capital of Ctesiphon. For Christians across the Mediterranean, this was more than a military defeat. It was a spiritual catastrophe. The holy city had fallen. The true cross was in pagan hands. It seemed like the end of the world. But there was another dimension to the fall of Jerusalem that would have far-reaching consequences. The Persians had not conquered the city alone. Jewish communities throughout Palestine had risen in support of the Persian invasion. And this was not passive support. This was military participation on a massive scale. To understand why, we need to step back and look at what life had been like for Jews under Byzantine rule. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had subjected its Jewish population to escalating restrictions. The Theodosian Code and later legislation had created a comprehensive system of discrimination that affected every aspect of Jewish life. Jews were barred from holding public office. They were forbidden from building new synagogues, though existing ones could be maintained. They were prohibited from proselytizing or converting Christians on pain of death. They could not own Christian slaves, which in an economy that depended on slave labor was a significant economic handicap. They were banned from marrying Christians. They were excluded from the military, and they were prohibited from entering Jerusalem except one day a year, on the anniversary of the temple's destruction, when they were permitted to weep at the ruins. For a people whose entire religious identity was bound up with that city, with the temple that had once stood there, this was a wound that never healed. The theological justification for these restrictions was elaborate. Christian doctrine held that the Jews had rejected and killed Christ, and their continued existence was explained as God preserving them as witnesses to Christianity's truth until the end times, when they would finally convert. This theological framework meant that Jews had to exist, but they also had to be subordinate, diminished, kept in their proper place as living testimony to both the truth of Christianity and the consequences of rejecting Christ. The emperors who ruled from Constantinople saw themselves as God's vicars on earth, responsible for maintaining the proper order of Christian society. That order required Jews to be visible but subservient, present but powerless. In practice, enforcement varied. Some emperors were more tolerant than others. Local conditions differed from province to province. Jewish communities found ways to survive and even thrive within the constraints, but the underlying legal framework was always there, always threatening. In 608, a pogrom in Antioch triggered Jewish revolts in several cities. Jews rose up in Tyre and Acre in 610, and the revolt in Tyre was crushed with a massacre. Under Emperor Phocas, conditions had deteriorated further, with reports of attempts to force conversion. A Jewish revolt in Antioch in 610 was suppressed with great violence. When the Persians invaded, many Jews saw an opportunity. The Sasanian Empire had a large Jewish community in Mesopotamia, centered around the great academies of learning in Babylon. The Talmud itself was being compiled in these academies during this very period. While Jews in Persia faced periodic difficulties under Zoroastrian rule, they generally enjoyed more freedom than their counterparts in Byzantine territory. They could hold positions of influence. They could practice their religion openly. The Persian king was not Christian. He had no theological investment in Jewish subordination. The Jewish exilarch in Babylon claimed descent from the house of David. He was recognized by the Persian government as the leader of the Jewish community and wielded real authority. This was something Jews in Byzantine territory could only dream of. When Persian armies crossed into Byzantine Palestine, Jewish communities faced a choice. They could remain loyal to an empire that had oppressed them for centuries, or they could take a chance on a different future. Many chose to fight. A wealthy Jew from Tiberias named Benjamin recruited and armed thousands of Jewish fighters from the cities of Galilee. According to Jewish sources, Benjamin was a man of immense wealth who used his resources to equip an army. Another leader named Nehemiah ben Hushel, who may have been connected to the Jewish exilarch in Babylon, organized additional forces. According to various sources, somewhere between 20,000 and 26,000 Jewish fighters joined the Persian army marching on Jerusalem. These weren't untrained civilians. They were armed soldiers who provided reconnaissance, auxiliary combat support, and sabotage against Byzantine garrisons. During the 21-day siege of Jerusalem in May 614, Jewish auxiliaries helped the Persians breach the city's defenses. They provided intelligence on the fortifications. They fought alongside Persian troops in the assault. And when the city fell, Christian sources claim that Jews participated in the violence that followed. Now, we need to be careful here. The Christian accounts of what happened in Jerusalem in 614 are filled with horror stories about Jewish atrocities. The monk Antiochus Strategos wrote that Jews purchased Christian prisoners from the Persians at the Mamilla Reservoir and slaughtered them. He claimed that between 57,000 and 66,000 Christians were killed in the conquest, though other sources give much lower figures around 17,000. Some accounts describe Jews gleefully murdering prisoners, destroying churches, desecrating holy sites. Other chroniclers added their own details. Stories circulated of Jews urging the Persians on to greater violence, of Jews taking personal revenge on Christian neighbors, of systematic destruction of Christian sacred spaces. How much of this was true? Modern historians have approached these sources with considerable skepticism. First, the numbers are clearly exaggerated. Archaeological evidence does not support the claim that tens of thousands were massacred. Excavations in Jerusalem show more continuity than the written sources suggest. The city was not reduced to rubble. Churches were damaged, but not universally destroyed. Second, the sources are biased. Antiochus Strategos was a Christian monk writing for a Christian audience. His purpose was to memorialize Christian suffering and demonize those responsible. Objectivity was not his goal. Third, there are problems with the narrative itself. Some of the stories seem designed to parallel biblical accounts of Jewish persecution of Christians, drawing on theological tropes rather than actual events. But something clearly happened. The Christian chronicles were written by people who had survived the conquest or heard accounts from those who had. They may have exaggerated, but they weren't inventing from nothing. Archaeological evidence does confirm mass graves from this period. Churches were damaged. Prisoners were taken. Jews had allied with the Persian enemy. Jews had fought against Byzantine forces. Jewish soldiers had participated in the siege and assault. And in the chaotic aftermath of the conquest, when order broke down and violence spread, Jews may well have participated in some of that violence. Whether the violence was as systematic and deliberate as Christian sources claim, whether Jews were the primary perpetrators or simply participants in broader chaos, whether the stories of purchasing prisoners for slaughter are accurate or theological fantasy, we cannot know for certain. What we can say is this: the perception was devastating. In Christian memory, Jews had betrayed them. Jews had joined the enemies of Christ to capture the holy city and desecrate its sacred sites. Jews had killed Christians with their own hands. This perception would have consequences that reached far beyond Palestine. When Jerusalem fell, some Jewish leaders believed they were witnessing the dawn of a new era. There were reports of an altar being erected on the Temple Mount. But sacrifices were supposedly renewed for the first time since the Roman destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Plans were discussed for rebuilding the temple itself. Nehemiah ben Hushel emerged as a leader, and some Jewish texts describe him in messianic terms, calling him the Messiah ben Joseph, who would prepare the way for ultimate redemption. One Jewish apocalyptic text from this period, the Sefer Zerubbabel, is filled with expectations of redemption. It describes visions of a war Messiah who would fight alongside the king of Persia against the forces of Rome, ultimately leading to the restoration of the temple and the coming of the Davidic Messiah. For many Jews, the conquest of Jerusalem looked like the beginning of the end times, the prelude to divine restoration that had been promised in Scripture. The messianic fervor was intense. For 500 years, Jews had dreamed of returning to Jerusalem, of rebuilding the temple, of restoring the worship that had defined their relationship with God. Generation after generation had prayed for this moment. And now, suddenly, it seemed to be happening. The Byzantine oppressors had been driven out. The city was in friendly hands. Jewish authority was being established. For 3 years, from 614 to 617, Jews enjoyed unprecedented autonomy in Jerusalem. Jewish settlers returned to the city that had been forbidden to them for centuries. Jewish religious authorities exercised power they hadn't held since before the Roman conquest. The dream of restoration seemed within reach. But the Persians were pragmatists, not idealists. They had used Jewish support to conquer Byzantine territory. But they had no intention of creating a Jewish kingdom. The Christian population of the Near East still vastly outnumbered the Jews, and the Persians needed to govern them. Supporting a Jewish minority against a Christian majority was poor imperial policy. By 617, the Persians had shifted their policy. They had conquered Egypt and were consolidating their hold on the Near East. They no longer needed Jewish military support to control Palestine, and maintaining a favored position for Jews was creating problems with a Christian majority. Christian complaints were reaching Persian administrators. The arrangement was becoming more trouble than it was worth. The Persians reversed course. Further Jewish settlement in Jerusalem was halted. The synagogue and altar on the Temple Mount were demolished. Nehemiah ben Hushel was reportedly killed. By his messianic movement crushed. According to some sources, Persian forces even attacked the Jewish contingent outside Jerusalem, resulting in thousands of Jewish deaths. One source claims 20,000 Jewish soldiers were massacred when they were no longer useful. The messianic moment had passed. The Jews had bet everything on Persian victory, and even before that victory was complete, the Persians had abandoned them. The dreams of temple restoration, of renewed sovereignty, of divine redemption, all of it collapsed within 3 years. But the damage to Jewish-Christian relations was permanent. The memory of 614 would shape Christian attitudes toward Jews for generations. The Jews had shown what they would do if given the chance. They had revealed themselves as enemies of Christ, as allies of pagans, as killers of Christians. And when the tide of war finally turned, when the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius launched his miraculous counteroffensive and drove the Persians back, the Jews of the Near East would pay the price. But so would Jews who had nothing to do with the events in Jerusalem. Jews who lived 1,000 miles away in cities that had never seen Persian troops, in a kingdom that had been at peace throughout the entire war, the Jews of Francia. When Heraclius became emperor in 610, the Byzantine Empire was on the verge of collapse. His predecessor Phocas had been a usurper and a tyrant, hated by nearly everyone. The Persian armies were rampaging through the eastern provinces, and there seemed to be no way to stop them. Heraclius himself came to power through a coup. His father, the Exarch of Africa, had launched a rebellion against Phocas. Phocas the younger Heraclius sailed to Constantinople with a fleet to complete the overthrow. When he arrived, the people of the capital handed Phocas over to him. Heraclius personally beheaded the deposed emperor, but inheriting the throne meant inheriting the war. And for the first decade of his reign, Heraclius could do nothing but watch the empire crumble. The Persians took city after city. In 614, Jerusalem fell. In 619, they conquered Egypt, cutting off Constantinople's grain supply. The empire was being strangled. There were moments when Heraclius considered abandoning Constantinople entirely and retreating to Carthage, where his family had its power base. The situation seemed hopeless. But Heraclius was not a man who accepted defeat easily. Beginning around 622, he launched one of the most remarkable military campaigns in ancient history. He reorganized the Byzantine army, stripped gold and silver from the churches to pay his troops, and turned the war against Persia into a holy crusade for the recovery of the true cross. The church willingly surrendered its wealth. Patriarch Sergius of Constantinople melted down sacred vessels and icons to fund the emperor's campaign. In return, Heraclius promised to restore the relics, to avenge the Christian blood that had been shed, to bring back the true cross to its proper home. The transformation of the war into a religious campaign had profound effects. Byzantine soldiers were no longer merely fighting for territory or tribute. They were fighting for Christ. They were on a crusade 5 centuries before the word would be invented. Heraclius didn't simply try to push the Persians back from Byzantine territory. He did something far more audacious. He invaded Persia itself. For 6 years, from 622 to 628, Heraclius campaigned deep in enemy territory. He marched through Armenia, across the mountains of the Caucasus, down into the Persian heartland. He allied with the Khazars and other Turkic peoples on the Persian frontier, building a coalition against the Sasanian Empire. He defeated Persian armies in battle after battle. In 626, when the Persians and their Avar allies besieged Constantinople itself, the city held, protected by its legendary walls and the Byzantine navy. The Patriarch Sergius led prayers day and night. Icons of the Virgin Mary were paraded along the walls. When the siege was finally broken, the Byzantines credited divine intervention as much as military skill. And in December 627, Heraclius won his decisive victory at the Battle of Nineveh, in the heart of Mesopotamia. According to Byzantine sources, the emperor killed the Persian commander in single combat. The Persian king, Khosrow II, fled to the mountains. Within weeks, his own generals had overthrown him, and his son Kavad II sued for peace. Under the peace treaty, the Byzantines recovered all their lost territories, their captured soldiers, a war indemnity, and most importantly, the true cross and the other relics that had been taken from Jerusalem. On March 21, 630, Heraclius marched in triumph into Jerusalem, personally bearing the true cross. The streets were lined with pilgrims and clergy who had waited over a decade for this day. Hymns echoed off the ancient stones. The true cross, draped in precious cloth, was carried through the same gates that Christ had entered centuries before. Heraclius himself walked barefoot, in imitation of Christ's humility. He was no longer merely an emperor. He was the champion of Christendom, the restorer of the holy places, the man who had defeated the fire-worshipping Persians and recovered the most sacred relic in the Christian world. Throughout the empire, churches proclaimed thanksgiving. In Constantinople, coins were minted celebrating the restoration. Sermons compared Heraclius to Constantine, to David, to the greatest rulers in Christian memory. After years of despair, there was hope again. But beneath the celebration, there was also rage. And Heraclius's triumph was shadowed by something else: vengeance. The emperor had not forgotten who had helped the Persians conquer Jerusalem in 614. He had not forgotten the 20,000 Jewish soldiers who had marched with the Persian army. He had not forgotten the reports of massacres at the Mamilla Reservoir, the destruction of churches, the desecration of holy sites. The Jews had made their choice in 614. Now they would face the consequences. Initially, Heraclius seems to have promised amnesty to the Jews of Palestine. Benjamin of Tiberias, the wealthy Jewish leader who had organized support for the Persians, switched sides and surrendered to Heraclius. He was supposedly baptized and granted a pardon. According to some accounts, Benjamin even accompanied Heraclius on his entry into Jerusalem. For a brief moment, it seemed like reconciliation might be possible. But Christian monks and clergy demanded punishment. The patriarch Zacharias, returning from his 14 years of captivity in Persia, insisted that the Jews who had aided the Persians could not be forgiven. Local Christian leaders cited Scripture. They invoked divine justice. They reminded Heraclius of the blood that had been shed, of the churches that had burned, of the Christians who had died. According to one account from Eutychius, writing in the 10th century, Heraclius would have kept peace with the Jews, had not fanatic monks instigated him to massacre. And Heraclius listened. Now, we should pause here and acknowledge the complexity of this moment. The Jews of Palestine had not been passive victims in the war. They had raised armies. They had fought alongside the Persians. They had, according to Christian accounts, participated in violence against Christian civilians. Whether those accounts were accurate or exaggerated, the perception was real, and it shaped Byzantine policy. At the same time, the response that followed was collective punishment on a massive scale. Jews who had fought alongside the Persians were punished, but so were Jews who had not. The entire community bore the consequences of choices made by some of its members. What followed was catastrophic. Throughout Palestine and into Egypt, there were massacres of Jewish communities. In 629, the situation escalated into wide-scale violence. Tens of thousands of Jews were put to flight from Palestine, fleeing to Egypt and beyond. Those who remained faced a stark choice: convert to Christianity or face death and exile. By 632, Heraclius had escalated to an empire-wide decree. On May 31st of that year, he ordered the forced baptism of all Jews in the Byzantine Empire. Jewish religious practices were forbidden. Sabbath observance and circumcision were prohibited under penalty of death. Synagogues were to be destroyed. The conversion was to be total. Now, forced conversion was actually quite rare in Byzantine history. Christian theologians had long debated whether forced baptism was even valid. If someone didn't truly believe, could they really be considered Christian? And there was the theological problem that some Jews had to exist until the end times for prophecy to be fulfilled. But Heraclius had a justification that went beyond theology. According to the Chronicle of Fredegar, a Frankish source written in the 610s, the emperor had received a terrifying prophecy. His astrologers had told him that his empire would be devastated by a circumcised nation. Heraclius believed the circumcised nation was the Jews. After all, Jews were the circumcised people par excellence, the people who had instituted the practice as a covenant with God. And Jews had just betrayed the empire to the Persians. They had raised armies against Constantinople. They had shed Christian blood. It made perfect sense to Heraclius that they would continue to be a threat. So he set out to eliminate that threat by eliminating Jews. Not physically, at least not all of them, but spiritually. If there were no Jews, there would be no circumcised nation to fulfill the prophecy. The empire would be safe. But far to the south, in the Arabian Peninsula, something else was happening. In the city of Medina, a man named Muhammad had been preaching a new religion for over a decade. His followers were called Muslims, and Muslims, too, practiced circumcision. The prophet died in 632, the same year Heraclius issued his forced baptism edict. Within 2 years, Arab armies had erupted out of the peninsula, attacking both Persian and Byzantine territory simultaneously. What happened next defies easy explanation. The Byzantine and Persian empires, which had spent 26 years tearing each other apart, now faced an enemy that neither had anticipated. Both empires were exhausted, their treasuries empty, their armies depleted, their populations weary of endless war. The Arab armies, by contrast, were fresh, motivated, and united by a new faith that promised paradise to those who died in battle. They moved with stunning speed across terrain that Byzantine and Persian generals had considered impassable. In 636, the Byzantine army was destroyed at the Battle of Yarmouk. one of the most consequential battles in history. Emperor Heraclius had gathered his remaining forces for a decisive confrontation. The Arabs under Khalid ibn al-Walid met them in the Syrian highlands near the Yarmouk River. A sandstorm blew into the Byzantine faces at a crucial moment. The Byzantine lines broke. The defeat was total. Sources claim that 70,000 Byzantine soldiers fell, though that number may be exaggerated. What is certain is that the cream of the Byzantine military, the last professional army that Heraclius could field, ceased to exist as a fighting force. Heraclius was forced to flee to Constantinople. According to one account, as he crossed the Bosphorus for the last time, he looked back at Asia Minor and whispered, "Farewell, a long farewell to Syria." The land he had spent his life fighting for was lost forever. Damascus fell. Then Antioch, the great city where followers of Jesus had first been called Christians. Then Jerusalem itself, surrendering to Caliph Umar in 638, just 8 years after Heraclius had entered it in triumph. The Patriarch Sophronius, who had helped instigate the persecution of Jews just years earlier, was forced to hand over the keys of the city to a Muslim conqueror. Heraclius, the triumphant emperor who had recovered the true cross just years earlier, watched helplessly as everything he had fought for was swept away. He died in 641, having lost more territory to the Arabs than he had ever recovered from the Persians. The prophecy of the circumcised people had come true, but the circumcised people weren't Jews. They were Arab Muslims. There's a grim irony here that we should sit with for a moment. Heraclius expelled or converted his Jewish populations to prevent a prophecy from being fulfilled. He removed thousands of people from their homes, destroyed communities that had existed for centuries, all because he believed Jews were the foretold threat. And while he was busy persecuting Jews, the actual threat was gathering in the desert. But here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Some historians have argued that the Byzantine persecution of Jews may have actually helped the Islamic conquest succeed. Jewish communities throughout the Byzantine Empire had experienced decades of oppression. They had been barred from public office, or forbidden from building synagogues, massacred after the fall of Jerusalem, and now faced forced conversion. They had every reason to resent Byzantine rule. When Arab armies arrived, many Jews saw them not as invaders, but as liberators. Under Islamic rule, Jews would face restrictions, certainly, but nothing like the forced baptisms and massacres of the Byzantine period. They would be allowed to practice their religion, maintain their communities, and participate in economic life. Some historians argue that Jewish support, or at least Jewish non-resistance, helped smooth the Arab conquest of the Levant and Egypt. The same communities that Heraclius had tried to destroy ended up facilitating his empire's collapse. If this is true, the persecution wasn't just cruel, it was also strategically foolish. Heraclius alienated a population that might otherwise have supported Byzantine rule, driving them into the arms of a new power that offered better treatment. Of course, we shouldn't overstate this. The Arab conquest succeeded primarily because of Arab military skill and Byzantine exhaustion after decades of war with Persia. Jewish attitudes were a minor factor at best. But it's still remarkable. The persecution that was supposed to prevent the prophecy may have helped fulfill it. But what about the Jews of Francia? They had nothing to do with the events in Jerusalem. They had not raised armies against Byzantium. They had not fought alongside the Persians. They had not participated in the conquest of the Holy City or whatever violence followed. They were merchants, craftsmen, and physicians. They lived in Paris and Marseille, or Arles and Narbonne. Their wars were trade disputes, not military campaigns. Their interactions with their Christian neighbors were, by all accounts, remarkably peaceful. And yet they were expelled anyway. The Chronicle of Fredegar tells us that Heraclius wrote to Dagobert, urging him to baptize all the Jews in his kingdom. The emperor explained his reasoning, the prophetic warning, the danger of the circumcised nation, the need for all Christian rulers to act together. Dagobert was young and pious. He had just inherited the entire Frankish Kingdom from his father Clothar. He was deeply invested in his relationship with the church. The bishops of Francia wielded enormous influence at his court. And unlike Heraclius, Dagobert didn't rule an empire that had just fought a 2-decade war. His kingdom was at peace, more or less. His treasury was full. His authority was secure. He could afford to make bold decisions. The Chronicle of Fredegar states simply that Dagobert promptly carried out the emperor's request. Now, historians have debated exactly what happened. The Chronicle of Fredegar is our only source for Dagobert's expulsion, and it was written decades after the events it describes. The chronicler was clearly influenced by the later Muslim conquests, which he mentions in connection with the prophecy. Some scholars have wondered if the story was embellished or even invented after the fact, but the evidence suggests something real did happen. After 629, there was virtually no mention of Jews in Francia for nearly a century. When they reappear in the historical record, it's as if they're starting over, with none of the continuity that characterized Jewish life in earlier centuries. The silence is telling. When previous church councils had to keep repeating their prohibitions against interaction with Jews, we knew Jews were present, and Christians were ignoring the rules. When the sources fall silent, it's because there's no one left to interact with. Why did Dagobert comply so readily? Several factors probably played a role. First, the church had been building pressure against Jews for years. The Edict of Paris in 614 had already excluded Jews from government service. The Council of Clichy in 626 or 627 had required that Jews in public office convert to Christianity. The Council of Reims in 625 had addressed concerns about Jewish influence. The trajectory was already pointing toward greater exclusion. The Frankish Church had been trying to separate Christians from Jews for over a century. Council after council had issued prohibitions against intermarriage, against Christians eating with Jews, against Christians observing Jewish festivals, against Christians employing Jewish physicians. The repeated nature of these prohibitions tells us they were being ignored, but the intent was clear. The Church wanted a Christian society distinct from and superior to its Jewish minority. Second, Dagobert was genuinely pious, and the news from Jerusalem would have reached Francia. Pilgrims and travelers brought stories. Church networks transmitted information across vast distances. The story of Jewish treachery in 614, of Jews raising armies against Christians, of massacres at the Mamilla Reservoir, would have been told and retold, and probably growing more dramatic with each telling. In the retelling, the complexity would have been lost. The reasons why Jews had allied with Persia, the centuries of Byzantine oppression, the hope for a better future, none of this would have traveled with the stories. What reached Francia was simpler. Jews had killed Christians. Jews had helped pagans conquer the Holy City. Jews had desecrated the sacred sites. The Jews of Francia may have been innocent of any involvement, but they shared a religion with those who had fought against Christendom. In the medieval mind, communal identity was strong. What one group of Jews did reflected on all Jews. The sins of the fathers were visited upon the children. The actions of Jews in Palestine became the burden of Jews everywhere. This was not a concept invented in 629. It was deeply embedded in Christian theology, which held that all Jews bore collective responsibility for the death of Christ himself. Third, there was the matter of ecclesiastical pressure. The bishops who advised Dagobert were in communication with their counterparts elsewhere. Pope Honorius I reportedly supported the forced conversion policy. The Frankish Church saw an opportunity to finally achieve what it had been working toward for generations, a purely Christian kingdom. The bishops around Dagobert had been educated in the same theological traditions that justified Jewish subordination. They had spent their careers working to separate Christian and Jewish communities. Now, with a Byzantine emperor himself demanding action, and the Pope apparently supporting it, they could push for what they had always wanted. Fourth, there was something simpler. Dagobert wanted to please his ally. Heraclius was the most powerful Christian ruler in the world. He had just achieved the greatest military victory in generations. He had recovered the true cross. Maintaining good relations with such a figure was valuable. The Frankish Kingdom had ambitions. Dagobert was actively expanding Frankish influence, sending armies against the Slavic tribes to the east, intervening in Visigothic politics to the south. Diplomatic ties with Constantinople enhanced Frankish prestige and opened possibilities for future cooperation. Rejecting Heraclius's request would have been a diplomatic insult. Complying with it was easy. The Jews of Francia had no army. They had no powerful protectors. They were a small minority in a Christian kingdom. But removing them cost Dagobert nothing and gained him Byzantine favor. Fifth, and perhaps most fundamentally, there was no reason for Dagobert to say no. From his perspective, the emperor's request was reasonable. A circumcised nation was prophesied to destroy the Christian empire. Jews were circumcised. Jews had just betrayed Christendom in the Holy Land. Converting or expelling them was simply prudent. Whatever the exact combination of motives, the result was clear. The Jewish communities that had existed in the Frankish Kingdom since Roman times were gone. Some converted. Many probably fled south to the region called Septimania, which was under Visigothic rather than Frankish rule, and where Jewish communities continued to exist. Others may have headed east, toward Italy, or the remnants of the Byzantine world. What happened to the expelled Jews? The sources give us only glimpses. Those who fled south would face their own difficulties. The Visigothic kings of Spain were hardly friendly to Jews. They had their own history of forced conversion attempts. But at least the immediate danger was past. Those who converted faced their own challenges. Were they accepted by their Christian neighbors? Were their conversions considered genuine? Medieval theology wrestled constantly with the question of forced baptism and its validity. And communities that had known each other for generations would have remembered who was born Jewish, regardless of what faith they now professed. The economic impact is harder to assess. Jewish merchants had played significant roles in Mediterranean trade, serving as intermediaries between different cultures and regions. And their removal may have disrupted certain trade networks, though the Frankish economy was predominantly agrarian and local. The great international commerce that had characterized the Roman period had already declined significantly by the 7th century. More significant may have been the loss of literacy and learning. Jewish communities maintained traditions of education and textual study that had few parallels in early medieval Europe outside monasteries. The physicians, scholars, and scribes who had served at various courts were suddenly gone. Whatever knowledge they held, whatever skills they possessed, left with them. But in Francia proper, in the heartland of what would become France, the expulsion of 629 created a void that would last for generations. When Jews finally reappear in Frankish records under Charlemagne in the late 8th century, they're treated almost as newcomers. The continuity with the Roman and early Merovingian periods has been broken. A new chapter is beginning. The communities that would later form in France under Carolingian and Capetian rule would be different communities. They would face different challenges, and they would experience more expulsions in the centuries to come. In that sense, Dagobert set a precedent. He demonstrated that a Christian king could expel his entire Jewish population and face no consequences. The kingdom didn't collapse. The economy didn't fail. God didn't send plagues or earthquakes in punishment. Later kings would remember that lesson. When Philip Augustus needed money in 1182, he expelled the Jews and seized their property. When Philip IV needed to cancel his debts to Jewish creditors in 1306, he expelled them again. When Edward I of England wanted to please his subjects in 1290, he expelled the Jews from his kingdom. None of these later expulsions directly cited Dagobert, but they didn't have to. The pattern had been established. The template existed. Christian kings could remove Jews when it suited them, and the world would go on. The logic of expulsion was seductive in its simplicity. When problems arose, when tensions surfaced, when plagues struck or harvests failed, there was always a population that could be blamed and removed. The Jews were perpetual outsiders, protected by some rulers but vulnerable to others. Each expulsion made the next one easier to imagine. and each expulsion came with economic benefits for those doing the expelling. Property could be seized, debts could be canceled, goods could be confiscated. Kings who needed revenue discovered that persecution could be profitable. Dagobert probably didn't think in these terms. He wasn't facing a financial crisis that Jewish assets would solve. His motivation seemed to have been genuinely religious, responding to what he perceived as a spiritual threat communicated by the most powerful Christian emperor in the world. But the machinery he set in motion would be used by less pious kings for less spiritual purposes. Whether Dagobert understood that he was setting this precedent is doubtful. He probably thought he was responding to a specific threat, following the lead of the Byzantine emperor, doing what a pious Christian king should do. But history is full of unintended consequences, and the consequences of 629 would echo for centuries. So what should we make of all this? The expulsion of Jews from the Frankish Kingdom in 629 was not a simple story of innocent victims and evil persecutors. It was the result of a complex chain of events that involved choices made by people on all sides. Jews in Palestine made the choice to ally with the Persian Empire against Byzantium. They raised armies. They fought. They participated in the siege of Jerusalem. And according to Christian sources, some of them participated in violence against Christians in the aftermath. Whether those accounts were accurate or exaggerated, they created a perception that shaped policy for decades. This was not a choice made without reason. Byzantine oppression had been severe. The laws restricting Jewish life were comprehensive and degrading. The periodic violence, the forced conversions, the prohibition against even entering Jerusalem, all of this had created a population with deep grievances and little loyalty to the empire. When the opportunity came to fight back, to ally with a power that promised better treatment, many Jews took it. It was a rational response to their circumstances. It was also a gamble that went catastrophically wrong. Byzantine Christians made the choice to respond to that alliance with collective punishment on a massive scale. They massacred communities. They forced conversions. They treated all Jews as guilty for the actions of some. This, too, was not without its logic, however twisted. From the Byzantine perspective, Jews had revealed themselves as a fifth column, a population that would ally with any enemy against Christendom. The prophecy of the circumcised nation gave theological justification for what was already a policy of retaliation. Heraclius may have believed he was protecting his empire from a genuine threat, but the punishment was disproportionate and unjust. Jews who had not fought, who had not participated in any violence, who had merely lived under Persian rule, were treated the same as those who had raised armies. The principle of collective guilt was applied without mercy. Frankish rulers made the choice to extend that punishment to Jews who had no connection whatsoever to the events in Jerusalem. They expelled an entire community to please an ally and satisfy the church. They participated in a coordinated campaign of religious persecution across Christian Europe. The Jews of Francia had done nothing wrong. They had not raised armies. They had not allied with Persia. They had not participated in any violence. They had lived peacefully alongside their Christian neighbors for centuries. Their only crime was sharing a religion with people 1,000 miles away who had made different choices. And the prophecy that supposedly justified all of this turned out to be about someone else entirely. The circumcised nation that would devastate Heraclius's empire was not the Jews he was persecuting, but the Arabs he wasn't watching. There are multiple tragedies here, layered on top of each other. The first tragedy is the Jewish alliance with Persia. It was understandable given Byzantine oppression, but it had terrible consequences. It gave Christians a narrative of Jewish betrayal that would be repeated for centuries. It provided a justification for persecution that went far beyond anything the actual events warranted, and it didn't even achieve its aims. The Persians abandoned their Jewish allies within 3 years, and the messianic hopes of 614 collapsed into nothing. The second tragedy is the Byzantine response. Heraclius had legitimate grievances against Jews who had fought alongside the Persians, but his response was collective punishment on a scale that far exceeded any justice. and it was based partly on a prophecy that he misinterpreted, leading him to target the wrong population while the real threat gathered in Arabia. The third tragedy is the Frankish expulsion. Jews who had nothing to do with any of these events were punished for them anyway. They lost their homes, their communities, their place in a society where they had lived for centuries. They were driven out because of things done by people they had never met, in a war they had never fought, in a city most of them had never seen. And the fourth tragedy is what came after. The expulsion of 629 established a precedent. It showed that Christian rulers could remove their Jewish populations without consequence. This lesson would be applied again and again throughout medieval history, culminating in the great expulsions of the 13th and 14th centuries that would reshape the Jewish geography of Europe. The irony is that while both sides were focused on each other, the real threat was emerging in the desert. The Arab Muslims would conquer more Byzantine territory in a decade than the Persians had taken in 20 years. And unlike the Persians, they would keep it. The expulsion of 629 teaches us something about how societies respond to crisis. They look for explanations. They look for enemies. They look for someone to blame. Heraclius needed to explain why his empire had almost collapsed. The prophecy gave him an answer: the circumcised nation. The Jews fit the description. The Jews had just allied with the enemy. The Jews were the threat. Except they weren't. The threat was something new, something that didn't fit any of the old categories. By the time anyone realized this, it was too late. Dagobert died in 639, just 10 years after the expulsion. He was around 36 years old. He was buried at St. Denis, the basilica he had built, becoming the first in a long line of French monarchs to rest there. His reign is remembered for other things. He was the last Merovingian to wield real power. He built churches and patronized saints. He fought wars against Slavs and expanded Frankish influence. In the centuries that followed, as the Merovingian dynasty declined into impotence and the Carolingians rose to replace them, Dagobert was remembered as a high point, a ruler who had actually ruled. Today, French children know Dagobert from a song that mocks him for putting his trousers on inside out. It's a silly song, meant to make children laugh. Few who sing it know anything about the historical Dagobert, and fewer still remember the expulsion. But the Jewish communities of France remember. They returned under Charlemagne. They built new communities in the Carolingian period. They faced new persecutions in the centuries that followed, culminating in the expulsion of 1306 under Philip IV, one of the largest mass expulsions in medieval history. And they came back again. The pattern repeated throughout Jewish history in France: expulsion and return, persecution and recovery, destruction and rebuilding. The communities that formed were never quite the same as what came before, but they were continuous in a deeper sense, linked by faith and tradition and memory across the gaps. Today, the Jewish community in France is one of the largest in the world, numbering over 400,000 people. It includes descendants of medieval French Jews who survived the expulsions and inquisitions. It includes Spanish and Portuguese Jews who fled the Iberian Peninsula after 1492. It includes Eastern European Jews who escaped the pogroms of the 19th and early 20th centuries. It includes North African Jews who came after decolonization in the mid-20th century. They are, in a sense, the continuation of the story that seemed to end in 629. The expulsion removed Jews from Francia, but it didn't remove Jews from history. The communities that Dagobert destroyed were eventually replaced by communities that endured. And maybe that's the final lesson of this strange and complicated episode. Empires rise and fall. Kings make decrees. Populations are expelled. But communities endure. They adapt. They survive. They return. The prophecy of the circumcised nation came true, but not in the way anyone expected. The Jews were expelled, but they weren't destroyed. The Franks thought they were protecting themselves from a threat, but the real threat came from somewhere else entirely. History is full of such ironies. People act on the best information they have. and they're often wrong. They persecute the innocent and miss the danger. They solve the wrong problem while the real problem grows. The story of 629 is also a story about the limits of knowledge. Heraclius thought he understood the prophecy. Dagobert thought he was being prudent. The bishops thought they were protecting Christendom. Everyone was wrong, but they couldn't have known that at the time. We look back now with the benefit of hindsight. We know that the Arab conquests were coming. We know that the Jews were not the threat. We know that the expulsion accomplished nothing except causing suffering to people who had done nothing wrong. But the people of 629 didn't have that knowledge. They were making decisions in real time, with incomplete information, based on the best understanding they could achieve. Their decisions were wrong, but the wrongness wasn't always obvious at the time. This doesn't excuse what happened. The expulsion was unjust by any standard. The collective punishment of innocent people for the actions of others was wrong in 629, just as it would be wrong today. The fact that decision-makers were acting on incomplete information doesn't absolve them of moral responsibility, but it does help us understand the human dimension of these events. The people involved weren't monsters. They were ordinary humans, making decisions under uncertainty, subject to the biases and limitations that affect all of us. They made terrible choices, but they made them for reasons that seemed compelling at the time. The expulsion of Jews from the Frankish Kingdom in 629 was a tragedy, but it was also a human tragedy, born of human fears and human choices, shaped by human limitations and human blindness. Understanding it requires understanding all of that complexity. The victims were real. The perpetrators had their reasons. The consequences were far-reaching, and none of it was simple. That's history. It's never simple, and the moment we make it simple, we miss the point. If you found this history interesting, this next video will shock you. Click right here to watch it now.